Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a lovely long weekend and didn't spend too much time thinking about the topic of today's discussion. We have a really great opportunity to be joined by Commissioner Cheryl LaFleur and Commissioner Neil Chatterjee to talk about the recent unanimous decision to end consideration of the DOE proposed grid resiliency pricing rule and initiate a new process to work with the RTOs in the states to think somewhat more broadly about the resiliency issues and determine what kind of next steps FERC might undertake. I think there's probably a lot of folks in the audience who know a little bit about this, so we're going to try to do something highly unusual and actually allow time for audience questions. We have about an hour. My plan is to talk to our two guests for about half of that, and so you can think ahead. I assure you I can bludgeon the audience with dozens of questions if you are not inclined to raise your own hands. But so just to get started and set the stage, I'd like to actually ask a pretty open-ended question, I guess, Cheryl, to you first, which is just talk a little bit about the substance of the issue, your decision, and if you're interested, maybe a little bit of kind of behind the music. This is kind of a dynamic moment for FERC, and you've reached a unanimous conclusion, and I think the audience would be interested in both the substance and the process, if you would.
Well, thank you, Jason. Well, where do I start? So the proposal came in. It was a proposal under, as everyone knows, a rarely used provision of the Federal Power Act to ask the Commission to issue a rule on certain changes to compensation for resources in the market, certain resources that were believed to contribute to the resilience of the system. And despite everything unusual about the way it came in, the timeline, and so forth, I think we tried to look at it as we look at things at the Commission. Okay, this is a proposal to change something. First of all, is the existing rate just and reasonable? Have they shown a problem, a factual problem with resilience or a legal problem with the existing rate? And then if so, which we found that they had not, but if so, is this a just and reasonable alternative? Is this proposal correct for the market? And I agreed with the majority, well, the unanimous decision that neither of those standards had been met. A resilience issue had not been demonstrated in that docket, and the proposal was not just and reasonable. As far as the kind of surround dynamics that were going on. What was interesting is that the Commission was changing membership as this was going on, just to add a little twist. And by the time we actually issued it, we had 5 members. I was very happy that we were able to come together. I think Chairman McIntyre brought us together on a consensus order, and then where we had separate things to say that were important to us, we said them separately.
So, Commissioner Chatterjee, obviously the Secretary of Energy, inspired this process, but you have, really been, I think, the driving force. I think there's been a lot of appreciation at the BPC and also, I think, in this room about the transparency that you brought to this discussion. I think you've made the point that a lot of the goal here was really kind of starting this conversation. So, again, it's been quite a wild 7 or 8 weeks. How you been doing?
Wild doesn't even begin to compass it. I mean, let's just take a look back a little bit. I get sworn in, I get confirmed on, I think, Friday the 4th. I'm sworn in on the 8th. I'm made temporary chairman on the 10th. And I think 5 weeks into the job, where I'm still trying to figure out where all the bathrooms are, we get hit with this significant proposal. I think in terms of how the Commission addressed it and how we went about it, a lot of it, you take a step back to my prior experience. I was coming from the Senate, where for a number of years we've confronted these issues about rapid transformations in our generation mix and what the impact of that might be. So from that standpoint, it was not a new issue. That said, I was coming at it from a new perspective, having the opportunity to be seated at the Commission. During my time in the legislative branch, I'd spent time with lawmakers of all political stripes who stressed the importance of fuel diversity and the need for an all-of-the-above energy strategy. And so initially I did express some sympathy with what the Secretary had laid out, which was, if in fact due to these rapid transformations in our generation mix, if we see the retirement of some of these baseload assets, what are the implications for that? And so I obviously upfront expressed that sympathy. That said, I was also very clear that if the Commission were to take any action, it would have to be legally justified, and that it would not distort markets, because I am a firm believer in markets and did not want to see any market intervention. And one of the things, again, I'm 5 weeks into the job when we get hit with this, as we went through the process, I came to really appreciate the fact-based, evidence-based approach that the Commission takes. I was aware of it prior to my confirmation to the Commission, but once you really get in there and start doing the work, you realize that we do things in a cautious, steady, legally defensible manner. And as we built the record, went through the record, and did the analysis, I came to the conclusion that my colleagues did, which is that while I feel Secretary Perry asked the right question, he proposed the wrong remedy, and that the remedy that was proposed in the NOPR did not meet the legal test that the Commission would oppose in that analysis. And I agreed with my colleagues in that unanimous opinion that we had to set the NOPR aside. I was also pleased, though, that all 5 of us came to agreement on the notion that resilience is something that needs to be explored further. The Commission has looked at these kinds of issues throughout the last number of years, but we've never had a really hyper-focused analysis of resilience. And I had stated all along my goal through this exercise was to come away with a longer-term process to answer the question that Secretary Perry had asked. And I'd finally say that while I wholly agree with my colleagues that the record did not support adopting the NOPR as it was proposed, I saw enough that I thought that there was merit in, while we do this longer-term analysis, having been a part of these processes for a number of years now in government, these things take time. And I thought there's enough of a record there. There's enough precedence for interim steps, hopefully market-based. I proposed relying upon the expertise of the RTOs and the ISOs who know their systems, who know where potential resilience challenges may be. And I thought, there are mechanisms in place to do this potentially in a market-based way, resorting to out-of-market compensation only as an absolute last resort. I thought there was enough of a record to support that. Nonetheless, even though that proposal was not adopted, I was very pleased with the ultimate outcome, particularly the fact that we're going to do it in a truncated time frame. And we'll see at the end of 90 days, the 60-day period plus the 30-day reply period, my colleagues and I will hopefully have a robust record to review and see what next steps go on from there. That was an important distinction for me, because I just don't want this to linger forever, and I think that that this kind of focused approach will serve the Commission and the country well.
I really appreciate you talking about the process, because, as you can imagine, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the question about how government functions is kind of at the core of what we do. And I think for anyone who mistrusts government action, the rigor, I think the integrity and the independence and the unanimity that FERC was able to show is really one of, I think, the brightest moments in just basic public service that I've seen in a while. So I really do appreciate both of you and Commissioner McIntyre for leading that effort. I want to dig in a little bit on the next steps of this process, but just before we do, a couple more thoughts on kind of the regulatory philosophy. This was an unusual choice by the Secretary of Energy. I happen to be a big fan of federal authority in energy markets because electrons move really fast and it's hard for the states to always get around them. But do you think that this marks a new kind of federalism? The executive branch actually trying to drive FERC policy in a way that hasn't happened before? Would we expect more of these kinds of notices and proposals coming from DOE, or would that be a good thing or not?
I mean, I think that's a question that you'd have to ask the Secretary of Energy. My sense of it is why I was appreciative of the action that the Secretary took. These are the kinds of difficult questions, and we saw as the dynamics played out and the intense interest in it, that because they're difficult, oftentimes they don't get addressed, or they get punted, or things are done around the margins. And I thought that, again, the Commission has addressed in some form or fashion these questions in the past, but what the Secretary has done now has put intense focus on it. We at the Commission are focused on it. DOE's focused on it. Stakeholders are focused on it. The RTOs and the ISOs are focused on it. And I think that was important to do. And I'm pleased that he took that approach. In terms of what it means, for future policymaking, it's also clear to me that, this isn't the first time that forces outside the Commission have tried to influence Commission policy. I think I read in Axios, Amy Harder had a column this morning that said this administration is exhibiting preference for, coal and nuclear generation. Doesn't differ that much from the Obama administration and leaders expressing a preference for wind and solar. You've seen administrations in the past try and influence independent agencies. I thought what we showed, and you characterized through this, is we demonstrated our independence, and that we will continue to do things, whether there's outside efforts to influence the Commission or not. We will continue to do things in a fact-based, evidence-based way.
Bubble up, top down. What's FERC best designed?
I mean, I guess I agree with the first thing that Neil said, which is that it's up to the Secretary whether he proposes more ideas like this, and it's his prerogative. What's important to me, though, is that whatever gets proposed, whether it's a complaint from a market participant or something that comes from the administration, we act as an independent agency and look at it based on the facts and the law that we're sworn to administer. And I think that's what we did in this case. I think administrations have, of course, had an influence on FERC policy. They've done so primarily by who they put on the Commission, which is how independent agencies work. I guess I disagree with Neil a little bit on how much we've done on this issue in the past. I mean, since I've been on the Commission for 7.5 years, a large percentage of our work has been driven by relentless changes in the nation's resource mix, the growth of domestic natural gas, the renewables, central station and distributed, storage and demand resources have, and of course, all the environmental rules at the federal level, at the state level, federal and state tax policy that are driving resource choices and changing where the nation gets its energy. And I would say that's been driving our market work, our reliability work, and our transmission work for much of the last decade. Things that we used to take for granted. I mean, I grew up in a system that was vertically integrated. I've made the analogy, like when you go to a baseball game, the starting pitcher, the setup man, and the relief pitcher. We had our base load, we had our intermediate, we had our peakers. We knew how the system ran. The supply stack was the same. On Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you made money at coincident peak when you hit the peak, and everyone underneath made money, and that's how the system worked even when it went to the market. What we're seeing now is with all the low-cost natural gas, the supply curve is very flat. We're seeing, in some cases, a surplus at peak, like in the California ISO, from all the zero marginal cost renewables. And that's having tremendous or roiling impact on who's making money, who's not making money in the markets, what kind of services the market operators have to put in place to make sure the lights stay on in all circumstances. And I think we've done a lot of work on that for the last several years. But by all means, let's continue this docket, see what the RTOs have to say. If there's something we should do, let's do it. And like my colleague, Commissioner Glick said, let's do it and get on with it.
All right, so let's start talking about the next couple of months. And maybe, Neil, to you first. So what do you expect and hope that the RTOs come forward with, and how do you imagine the process moving forward depending on that input?
Yeah, I want to be careful not to prejudge any outcomes. I thought that the questions that we put forth in the underlying order, were thoughtful and thorough to really draw out from the RTOs how they handle resilience, where potential challenges might be, and what potential paths forward there may be. And so I expect these guys are the experts, and I expect robust answers to those questions. I also anticipate that the additional 30-day period for reply comments, like we saw in the composition of the record on the NOPR. I think because of the intense focus on this, we're likely to get a lot of thoughtful replies and comments, and we'll hopefully have, again, what I hope to be a thorough, robust record to review and to make a determination on how best or if we should move forward. And again, it's got to be in the record, and we'll make the determination from there.
Commissioner LaFleur, without prejudging, but based on what RTOs have said in the past, like the PJM Resilience 2020 study and others, do you anticipate that on-site fuel storage will be a dominant aspect, or just among the different ideas that states propose?
Well, I think we asked a rather broad set of questions, and I think that we'll hear different, resilience, how you make your system more resilient depends on what risk you're mitigating against. And I think we'll hear about different risks from different regions. What I think is good about the process is the opportunity to have a focused, fact-based look at each region. Now, where I'm from, up north, where the Patriots play, there's a well-known constraints in the gas supply. So when we have our winter reliability session at the commission every November, a lot of time is taken talking about fuel issues in New England and what kind of backups they have and so forth. In other parts of the country that are sitting on top of the Marcellus and the Utica Shale with pipelines going in a lot of directions, that's not as dominant an issue, but there may be other issues that those market operators come forward with. Certainly, if you look at California, they're seeing a very different resource mix, and a lot of what they've been coming forward to with the commission, to our commission, relates to ramping resources, storage resources, how they run the system in a new way. So I think we'll hear different things from different regions.
I want to very quickly echo Commissioner LaFleur's remarks. That Tom Brady is, in fact, the greatest player in the history of the NFL. But beyond that, she raises a key point, and you asked a key question. One of the things that I thought was difficult about the NOPR as it was proposed was the focus on a 90-day fuel supply, and it seemed to indicate a predisposition to favor particular fuel sources. And I think that what I hope to see in the record we develop and the analysis we do going forward is that we approach it in a fuel neutral way, because I do think there are different challenges in different regions, and we ought not, as Commissioner LaFleur eloquently put it, we don't start with a fuel supply and work backwards. We work in a fuel neutral manner going forward, and I think that is an important component of this conversation.
So just to tease that a little farther, I interpret what you're saying that there's a very real possibility that you'll see coal and nuclear take very divergent paths if you look at criteria beyond on-site fuel. I think is that a fair assumption?
We'll have to see what they come back with. I think, my sense of this is you're going to see different challenges in different regions. You're going to see there's just different variables and different factors at play, and I leave it to the experts in the RTOs and the ISOs to identify where their challenges are and what the plausible paths forward may be. I can't anticipate what those paths forward would be today.
Well, in the first instance, we asked the market operators who, their first name is independent, and they are not looking at it, I don't believe, from the standpoint of a particular fuel, but from the standpoint of their system and the portfolio that they're running. One of the I've said many times, in a lot of these complicated issues, it is to be expected that people come before the commission and their commercial interests, because after all, they're in business for their owners, their stakeholders, stockholders, their commercial interests, the policy issues all get kind of garbled up together like spaghetti on the plate. And we have to look to the best of our ability as 5 human beings to look and try to see through everyone's individual commercial arguments and try to see what's the best thing for customers who are paying the bills. And I think in this case, starting with the RTOs and ISOs is a good place to start to frame the issues, but then everyone else will have a chance to chime in.
Has there been any enthusiasm or groaning about the 60-day timeline? This entire process has been really animated by speed.
Well, I try not to think of all the young associates that are working weekends and all the law firms. I think it respected, number one, an attempt to continue on the importance of the issue as set by the Secretary's initial timeline. And number two, we have a lot of other things to do at the Commission. We have a lot of policy issues backed up from 2017, and we don't want to work on this the whole year. We have other things to do also.
I guess that's a perfect follow-on to my next question, which is thinking about that broader docket as it relates to the power sector. How do you see these issues interacting with the challenges around market function, price formation? Do you imagine these are going to stay as separate questions, or do you think they might start to come together?
I think, from my standpoint, these are prior to the Secretary proposing the NOPR. This is what I had anticipated that we would be spending a good amount of time this fall addressing, some of the price formation issues, state policy issues, reliability challenges that are out there. And so I think certainly having a focused docket and proceeding on looking at grid resilience is important, but we are going to continue to address these other challenges as well, and we'll see where the potential interplay may come in.
I agree. I think that some of the issues that this docket might serve up for consideration have echoes. For example, the suggestion of paying baseload because certain units weren't thriving in the market has echoes in some of the state proposals to subsidize certain resources. So I think there are commonalities between this docket and many other dockets we have, but I think that we shouldn't let this swallow everything the Commission is doing. We have to continue on all fronts.
So I have a final question. I'm going to open it up for a while. And it follows really, I think, on your shout out to Amy Harder, trying to put this in broad context. I've been in this business for about 25 years, and at least once a week someone tells me that we shouldn't pick winners and losers and the market should decide. And then every elected branch, after repeating that, decides that it likes something that's uneconomic and immediately finds a market failure, which requires a proactive cure. And do you see FERC as kind of the folks on the wall who are protecting markets from those political inspirations? And how do you imagine existing in a political environment where you're not supposed to have preferences for different fuel types?
Yeah, that's one of the things I've been very appreciative since coming to the Commission. I do believe that FERC is in a place to play that role of ensuring the integrity of markets and the efficiencies of markets. Now, markets aren't perfect. As I said repeatedly throughout this process, the markets today aren't what they were 20 years ago, and FERC has continually made iterative changes to the market, but has done so in a fact-based, evidence-based, fuel-neutral way. But there's no question that these challenges persist. Look, in my prior capacity working in the United States Senate, there's no question. I worked for my home state senator who was focused on, the preservation of coal-fired generation due to the impact that it had on the constituency that he represented. And he was concerned about whether it be environmental regulations or favorable tax considerations that led to other fuel sources putting pressure on the domestic fuel source that was important to the livelihood of people in the state. And he was, and I will say I myself am concerned. I thought Commissioner LaFleur, in her concurrence, made an outstanding point that I agree with, that we need to focus on easing the transition to the future, not slowing the transition from the past. But I'm sensitive to that transition because I've grown up around the people that are suffering from that transition. And I thought Commissioner Glick, in his concurrence, very eloquently talked about the plight of people in these communities. So you can understand why elected officials take these kinds of steps. I don't think it's, in this instance, picking winners and losers. It's protecting the livelihood and viability in communities where, once the jobs go away, there aren't really alternative opportunities for employment, and the only value people in some of these communities have is the value of their homes, but then they can't sell their homes because there aren't economic opportunities in the communities. That's a real challenge. That said, as I came to the commission, despite the fact that I had those sympathies, everything that I've just laid out, that's not a part of our record. We don't evaluate those factors. And I think Commissioner Glick was correct to say it's up to Congress to try and address those issues. As market regulators, as reliability regulators, we don't factor in those considerations. So this is my long-winded Senate filibuster way of saying that I do believe elected officials are going to continue to fight for the various modes of power generation that are beneficial to the constituencies they represent. But it's FERC's role to block all that out and focus on a evidentiary-based, fact-based, record-supported, legally justified path forward.
Well put.
Well, definitely, markets have winners and losers, and change is hard. I was in New England when several of the first Yankee plants closed, and I saw the impacts up close on those communities and tried to, in those days, take as many of the workers as we could into the regulated electric company, because there weren't a lot of other jobs in some of the communities where plants were located. I have several relatives who have worked at the Brayton Point Power Station in Massachusetts, which closed earlier or in the middle of last year, and relatives who still live in the shadow of the plant. I know how important and difficult that is. The difference between Congress, where people are elected to represent a region and do so vigorously, and FERC is, even though we might all have our football teams, we are supposed to be working for the nation as a whole to the best of our ability. And it's possible to make our job sound really hard with a lot of acronyms and a lot of docket numbers, but really, it's pretty simple. We have to keep the lights on for everyone at the least cost we can, and just focus on if we ask customers to pay for something, we have to be sure they need it and that it's fair to put it in their bill. That's the way we looked at this docket, and that's the way I think we have to keep looking at the issue.
A perfect moment. We have 3 fleet-footed mic runners. If anyone has a question, please raise a hand and identify yourself. Always the starts from you. All right.
All right, Darius Dixon with Politico. In the lead up to, I guess, the decision last Monday, because Jason brought up the institution of FERC, and I guess in the Secretary's 403 here, I mean, was there any concerns from both of you about the institution, about how that order made FERC look to regulated entities, to members of Congress? FERC has a very, I think, stable reputation of being an impartial arbiter, so I'm kind of curious how that played in the building and what concerns you may have had about how it looked.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I care deeply about the institution qua institution, its independence, its reliance on fact and law to make decisions, and the wonderful employees we have who are spending their careers with us doing all this work for us. So there certainly was a lot of, not to put it back on the press, but there was a lot of frenzy in the press about this changing FERC and so forth. And I was very happy that we were able to come together on a consensus order and then put our different thoughts in separate statements and move forward. It felt like a very FERC-like day. And in my value system, that's good.
I mean, I just want to echo that again. Obviously, this was being new to the commission. This was the first sort of major proceeding that I'd been a party to. But having been a long-time observer from FERC from the outside, I do think that despite the frenzied attention that was paid to the process throughout, that the ultimate conclusion was a very FERC-like conclusion. And I thought that the fact that we were able to gain consensus around the key questions of, setting aside the NOPR, but opening up a new docket and a new proceeding while doing it in a unanimous basis, which, again, to echo former Chairman Kelleher, FERC speaks loudest when it speaks with one voice. I thought we achieved that, but then the process also allowed for those of us who had our individual views on the proceeding to lay those out. And I think certainly there are distinctions between the concurrences that we all put out, yet we all came together on the underlying order. And I think that speaks very well of the institution. And I am optimistic and pleased to have the opportunity to serve in the institution going forward. And I think that this was a great opening exercise for me to get pretty quickly up to speed on a lot of things.
We have a couple of questions here.
Glenn Bozert with SNL Energy / S&P Global. My question is, when it comes to nuclear power, there's a lot of sentiment that nuclear power is needed for reasons other than economic, including environmental reasons. And you both spoke about how if customers are going to pay for something, it's got to be worth it, and it's got to be something that they should be paying for. So my question is, how does that issue kind of play into FERC's decision-making process as this docket goes forward? Does FERC have any responsibility to look at the desires of states or other parties to keep nuclear power viable? And I recognize that FERC is not an environmental regulator, but at the same time, there are other issues that kind of play into this. So I'm kind of curious about your views on how FERC should deal with the nuclear power issue, and if it's something that you have a responsibility to look at, or it's not something that will play into this docket.
Well, I guess I'll take your last question first. I don't think it's something that will play in this docket, because what you're talking about now, I believe, is an environmental driver for choice, not specifically a resilience driver, although I know they can come together if it's more resilience against preventing climate change, but I think that's not the top resilience issue we talked about here. It was more how you run the portfolio. To the extent that regions or make it, and I'm going to try to be careful to avoid talking about the dockets we have before us with respect to challenges to market rules on the zero emissions credits in Illinois and New York. But to the extent that regions decide or states decide that carbon is something they want to value, just like other fuel neutral attributes that can certainly be valued by the market. We see it with CARB being played into the market in California, and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the markets, ISO New England, New York, and PJM, that have states within them that are part of RGGI, factor that in. And right now, I think we, after May 1 and 2, when we talked a lot about how environmental factors might be factored in the market in a market fair way, we encourage states to, regions to go off and work on this. And I know New York has done a lot of work about potentially pricing carbon into its market, and I believe that can be done, is being done, could be done more so. Because we're not an environmental regulator, it's probably not going to emanate from FERC saying, hey, we have environmental concerns, go change your market rules. But if proposals come before us, I think I would look to make sure that they're fuel neutral and will respect a fair market price. And I think we've done that with CARB and RGGI already.
I want to just echo the Commissioner's remarks and cite my previous filibuster in that, look, I'm a big believer in nuclear power and the value that nuclear power provides to this country. You cite the environmental benefit. There's no question that nuclear power is our single greatest source of baseload carbon-free generation, and I think that could be a significant component. There's a jobs component to nuclear power and an economic component in local communities to nuclear power. And there's also a security component to having fuel diversity and having nuclear power. I think a lot of people had fun at Secretary Perry's expense for commenting that, you know, what is the price of freedom? But my guess is he was citing the need to look at the security implications of a loss of fuel diversity. And those are all factors that ought to be considered. But you know, what I came to appreciate in going through this process is those aren't factors that we consider in the docket with our defined role. But you do raise a very important question about the long-term viability of nuclear power, and I think policymakers across the government and stakeholders throughout the country need to take seriously, what the implications are to the country from a security standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint, if we don't have nuclear generation as part of our portfolio for the long term.
If I could get a second bite at the apple, I don't think we're losing our fuel diversity in this country. I think we're just having a diversity of different fuels in different places, and it's evolving. We have 99 nuclear plants operating in this country. We don't seem to be on a path, at least in the short time frame, to replace them for a host of reasons, but recent developments have certainly underscored that with some of the plants that are under construction. So we're really talking about what's the trajectory for those 99 plants and what's the trajectory from here to what currently looks like it'll be the future. Realizing the future may have other ideas of where it wants to go, but we can only look at what's trending now. And what's trending is more gas, more renewables, more distributed solutions, and we need to figure out what the rules can be to make sure we protect resilience in that situation. I think nuclear is going to be a piece of the mix for a long time, but I also think the future is trending toward different resources because they're coming on.
We have another question in the middle. Yep. And then we'll...
Hi, Tom Tiernan with the Foster Report. Jason asked this question a little bit, but I want to follow up on it a little bit. If you expect DOE to pursue this inquiry in a different form in the future, and if either of you have discussed the issue with any colleagues at DOE in the last few weeks.
I've, had conversations with the deputy secretary. I have seen no indication whatsoever that they would pursue any kind of affirmative action on this. I thought the secretary, the deputy secretary, Mark Menz's statements all were very respectful of our process, and that they looked forward to continuing to work with us going forward. I was appreciative of that, and I did not get any indication from them that they intend to take further action on this, and that they will respect our process and allow this new proceeding that we've commenced to move forward.
Carolyn, find someone in there in the back corner.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Commissioners. Gavin Bade with Utility Dive. I noted in the Commission's decision that you guys called out some of the pricing reform dockets going on at regional grid operators, particularly PJM and ISO New England. Talking to some of the consumer advocates, other critics in those regions, they would say that some of those pricing proposals are backed by the same type of asset owners who push the NOPR, owners of large, perhaps baseload power plants that aren't necessarily competitive in organized markets. My question is, as you're evaluating these pricing proposals that will probably come up in this resilience docket, how do you ensure that this isn't another, or perhaps the first, depending on how you look at, round of rent seeking from the owners of these baseload assets?
Well, I think as we look at any pricing proposal from a regional operator, whether it's in this docket or more likely, I think, in another docket, we need to do the same kind of inquiry of making sure it's just and reasonable, and looking and coming up with a fair and just and reasonable way to set price. I think that's why we take views from the ISOs and from a lot of stakeholders. We have our own economists. Changes in the way we set locational marginal prices are significant because they're the backbone of the market. And I think that was something we would look at very closely if those proposals come in. But I'll draw an analogy, although it's different, to the capacity performance and paper performance proposals that came in on from ISO New England and PJM. I think I have the number, that it was paper performance is ISO New England, capacity performance is PJM. Those also had a lot of support from people who own baseload units, but we looked at the facts, the evidence in the record, and I at least decided that that was fair to approve those changes, that it was responding to a real need, one that has a lot to do with resilience, in my view, making sure we have enough power on peak, not on peak, but at times of system stress. And so the fact, we didn't judge it by who proposed it, we judged it by the facts, and that's what we'll do with any, I believe we'll do with any new proposals.
I would just add to that, and I think I addressed this earlier, there are other proceedings that touch upon some of these similar issues, but my hope is that we don't conflate them with this docket, that this docket will be focused on answering these questions about resilience, and to the extent that there's crossover with other issues, we will deal with that as that arises, but I think it needs to be clear that these are distinct proceedings.
Anyone else in the corner while we have the, all right. Rich, can you hand it to me? And then we'll move over to this side.
Yeah, and then Rob.
Hi, Courtney Grosvenor from the DOE Policy Office. Many of the comments, or at least some of the comments in the NOPR docket, talked about issues that we typically think of as reliability issues, or are even defined as reliability standards or metrics, and talked about them in terms of resilience. And I was wondering what you expect FERC to do in terms of defining particular measurable attributes as resilience, maybe based on the RTO and ISO comments that you expect to receive, or on the reply comments, or other sources of definitions. There's been, excuse me, quite a bit of confusion, and I'm very interested to hear your perspectives on those two definitions.
Well, first of all, I think personally that resilience is a part of reliability. Reliability is all the things that go into keeping the lights on. Resilience, which I think we all understand intuitively because we use it in general conversation about all kinds of things, is the ability to sustain difficult things and keep on going. And so I think that we did ask for comments in the docket on sharpening up the definitions, but I think that intuitively we understand it. It's the tying of money to resilience that brought all the, is it all heat and no light or whatever, into the conversation. In terms of the tools in our toolkit, as I said in my separate statement, we really have three basic tools: market changes, defining a fuel neutral attribute like pay per performance or ramping, or frequency regulation, and how are we going to get that attribute. We have operating rules of the grid. Everybody has to supply reactive power, or some kind of change in the operating rules, like when we change the small generator interconnection to require certain essential reliability services to be provided, and the large generator for that matter. And the third is reliability standards, where we don't propound them ourselves. We can direct NERC to do one, and we've done that with geomagnetic disturbances, certain aspects of cybersecurity, and so forth. Those are the three basic statutory tools we have, and once we see what the resilience issue is, it may lend itself to one tool or another, if there is an issue.
I think resilience is distinct from reliability. It's where we maybe slightly differ on this. And I think it's important that we're going to look at this. I think what the initial proceeding and docket showed, and what I hope to further flesh out in this new proceeding is, perhaps the threats of a loss of resilience maybe aren't as dire as some generators are making them out to be, but they're certainly not as insignificant as some proponents of new generating sources are making them out to be. And I think that is why this proceeding is will continue to be very, very important, because we do need to answer the questions that you lay out about how to value these attributes.
So right here in the middle, I think we have time probably for 3 or so new questions.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm Rod Cookrow with E&E News. The first thing Chairman McIntyre did was ask for that 30-day extension so we could get up to speed on the issues surrounding the NOPR. Both of you are former chairmen, and I'm wondering if you could sort of characterize for us what leadership style he took in trying to approach the rest of you on this very difficult first task he had facing him to sort of get to a point where you could speak with one voice. And second of all, how does that color sort of how you see his leadership style going forward as FERC approaches the rest of these issues that you all say you want to get to this year?
I think he was fantastic throughout the process, and I think he came in. Again, he was not unfamiliar with the underlying issues. He's got a lot of experience, and he's a smart guy, and I think was very up to speed on the dynamics of what we were facing. I think what he wanted was time to go through the record and see what the record would allow for. And we had extensive conversations about, my perspectives on this. And I thought that he approached things in a thoughtful, reasonable way to ensure that all of our concerns and considerations were reflected in the underlying order. And I think he was able to gain consensus because he did work with all of us. And I think the underlying order does have components that are directly attributable to each of us. And I thought that was an elegant way to approach this. What I come, in my short time at the commission, what I'm kind of seeing as I ferret out, the role, it's quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative. And I thought, having been from the legislative branch, he demonstrated quality legislative skills in bringing us together, but it's also quasi-judicial. We were constrained by what's in the record and what our statutes allow, and I thought he threaded that needle very, very well.
Well, I certainly understood his getting the extension, even though in the initial moment I said I felt like one time in college where exams were postponed because of the energy crisis. No, they can't postpone exams. But I thought he did an excellent job figuring out where the center of the commission was and where the five of us could agree and codifying that in an order. And then, but also recognizing that people have distinct voices on other aspects and that went in separately. And I thought that's precisely what a chairman should do, and I'm optimistic about his leadership going forward. He started with the tough one.
So for my first time in the 10-year history of the Bipartisan Policy Center, I have the distinct honor of calling on my wife, who actually is even more enthusiastic about these topics than I am.
Stephanie Gourmet with Capstone. If you are convinced that resiliency attributes should be compensated by ratepayers, could we see a different array of resiliency attributes move forward for compensation in the different RTOs and ISOs? And just, can you give me anything on the way you think about the magnitude of compensation for such attributes?
What I think about the magnitude of compensation is it should, if at all possible, be determined by the market. And I think that's true whether you're talking about carbon or whether you're talking about frequency response. You should figure out what's the cheapest way to get what you need, what your customers need, and then what's the cheapest way to get it so that customers don't pay more than they have to. If there are things that can't be set by the market, then I think there should be general standards so everybody's on the same playing field. In terms of could there be different issues? Yes. I think, for example, New England has a somewhat interesting infrastructure situation. I've said a few times the corners of the country have the hardest time getting gas. But one corner has lots and lots of hydro, so they have a different situation. But we've seen when we had our gas electric docket a little more issues when you're farther from the supply. And there are other issues driving infrastructure issues in New England. I think that's somewhat unique to that region. I think we've seen already, for example, MISO stepping forward with a ramping tariff because of the tremendous introduction of wind power in western MISO. And we didn't see other regions come at the same time to do a ramping tariff because they don't all face the same situation at the same time. So I think we could see unique proposals in different regions.
I think I echo that, and I think it reflects the complexity of these issues and these challenges. And again, one of the reasons that I felt that the record warranted, that short-term show cause order is because just based on the complexity of your question, it is going to take time to sort through this. I'm under no illusions that this process will end in 90 days. And so, but I think you raise important points, and we'll see what comments, what the RTOs and ISOs come back with, and what comments are reflected to that, and proceed from there. And certainly, I think what the commissioner laid out are potential options, or we may see others. We'll just have to see what comes in.
Just because you're trying to have debate here, one of the reasons I didn't support the putting forth of an interim solution because I didn't think a problem had been demonstrated that made the current rules not just unreasonable. To me, an interim solution, which by definition you've done quickly on a fast record, has to have, if anything, even more evidence, kind of like a preliminary injunction. You have to get through quite a bit to prove that it's there, and I just didn't see that evidence in this record. I think, and I actually think doing out-of-market things could potentially hurt markets, so the balance of equities was the other way in my view.
I think we have time for two more tightly framed questions.
Rich is impatient. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner. Rich Hydorn, RTO Insider. I wanted to build on a question that Glenn had asked about the nuclear initiatives in the states, but bring it back to something that you, Commissioner LaFleur, said and Commissioner Glick said in recent opinions regarding the impact of greenhouse gases. You cited it in the pending review of gas pipeline licensing. Commissioner Glick mentioned it in his concurring opinion, talking about the impact of coal-fired plants on climate change. So I'm wondering, although FERC is not an environmental organization, does a consideration of resiliency have to also start to incorporate greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I also, I think, mentioned it in my concurrence as a driver of some of the power supply changes, concerns about climate change. We'll see what comes forward in the docket. There's two different ways people have looked at addressing climate change. One is mitigation, changing what we do to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, and I think that's driving a lot of choices that are being made at the state level and at the customer level too about where they want to get electricity. And we've been more reactive than driving, but I think that's shaping a lot of our work. The second thing is adaptation. I mean, we're seeing people secure their substations where they're near the water, take things away from the water because they're recognizing the reality of climate change, and there we're playing more of a rate role than a driving role. But I think it's shaping a lot of our work, and we'll see what comes forward in the docket. It's certainly something that's high on my mind. I mean, I think the larger issue of how we adapt the energy system to the climate challenge is the shaping issue of our time. It's just being looked at in different ways at different times by different administrations.
I'll just add to that, as I said earlier, I think, and I've said repeatedly, I believe climate change is real. I believe it's man-made, and I believe we ought to take steps to mitigate it. And I think one of the reasons that I am such a strong proponent of nuclear power is, as I earlier stated, it is the single greatest source of base load emission-free generation that we have. And again, from the onset, my prior work leading to my coming to the Commission and in looking into this question of resilience, the reason for the initial sympathy that I expressed for Secretary Speicher's proposal is because I really do want to understand if what role nuclear power will play in our future generation mix, and what it would mean if over the course of time in the future we did not have access to domestic nuclear power. From a security standpoint and an environmental standpoint, that could be significant, and that's just something that I want to very cautiously study as we go forward.
If I could just follow up, aren't you undermining that, though, by also your support for coal?
So I just want to be clear. A lot of people intertwined, nuclear power and coal throughout this docket. I was very clear, echoing Commissioner LaFleur, that we were going to do this in a fuel-neutral way, that we weren't going to favor fuel sources, whether coal or nuclear or not. That was one of the challenges with the Secretary's proposal, is that by focusing on 90 days of on-site fuel, it seemed to be favoring certain fuel sources, and that is why it didn't meet legal muster, and we voted unanimously to turn it down. And again, when I've spoken of my support for coal-fired generation, I'm speaking to the communities in which I grew up in and the plight of those communities, but that is not pertinent to my role as a FERC commissioner in terms of the decision making that we have going forward. And I also don't think that my support for those communities is irreconcilable with also believing that climate change is something that we need to address.
Time for a final tight question.
Paul Marion from MLEX. One way to address the resiliency is through more pipelines, especially in some parts of the country. Do you have any insight into whether the White House's infrastructure proposal will call for building more pipelines, including changes in the law to expedite permitting and streamline permitting?
I haven't seen it, and I'm not aware of it. The one thing I'll speak to is I was pleased that Chairman McIntyre, at one of his first significant actions at his first open meeting, announced that we'd be revisiting our policy statement, and I look forward, quite frankly, to having as robust a conversation about that proceeding as we've had about the NOPR the last several months.
Earlier in the time of the administration, there was a lot of talk about expediting permitting, so it wouldn't surprise me if that, I haven't heard conversations with anyone, but if that comes forward as part of a proposal. I certainly share Commissioner Chatterjee's enthusiasm about the relook at the Commission policy statement on pipelines, something I've been calling for some time. I think pipelines have a complicated relationship with climate change. They help, they've been critical to displacing more carbon intensive units such as coal, but they also are long-lived resources that rely on fossil fuel, and we're seeing some regions begin to think of them in that way. So I strongly support a look at both how we assess need for pipelines as well as how we do our environmental review. I have no illusions that there are easy answers out there. I sometimes think of President Kennedy saying we don't do it because it's easy, we do it because it's hard. I think relooking at the pipeline policy statement is going to be very hard, but that's what we're paid to do, to try to look at these things.
So as I think indicated earlier, this decision and your comments today really make me proud of our government. And it's nice to be able to say that, and I'd like you all to join me in welcoming and thanking our peers. We're a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.